Yeah, this is actually the inaugural episode of How to Meet Your Neighbor.
Such an honor. I love it.
Yeah, I've got more episodes coming up to be recorded, but it's great to have you on, John Simmerman, because for folks who don't know you, you've got a awesome catalog and ongoing episodes you put out of interviews with folks involved in what I think is most accurately described as active transportation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the work we're doing is right on that cusp, the intersection of what I like to call the built environment and health and well-being. And so, yeah, active transportation, active mobility, active living. And because my background is in public health, and I really see the world, our built environment through the lens of, well, does it encourage us to live a healthy, active lifestyle or not? That's where I suddenly, started dipping my toes into urbanism and, architecture and street design and community design and town planning. Next thing you know, you're in a deep, rabbit hole of all things built environment and urbanism and transportation and mobility. And it's super fun. I've been absolutely enjoying this last 2 decades of playing in this environment, which the previous decade and a half of my career, I was really just focused on healthcare cost containment efforts mostly for Fortune 500 companies. But yeah, so this has been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah, it goes deep, and one can find themselves lost in the subject matter. I've only recently come to think consciously about this topic. For me, it was really COVID and mandated work from home back in 2020. I quadrupled the amount of time that I spent in my neighborhood where I reside. And a really positive side effect of that was getting to meet a lot more of my neighbors than I ever imagined. And also, a side effect of that was having a much more sedentary lifestyle of being a keyboard warrior for my day job, and my wife and I really needing to walk and then bike and find physical activities to supplement our otherwise super sedentary lifestyle. So it had awakening for me back in 2020 as to all of the topics that you mentioned. Although I don't professionally work in public health or addressing these, I'm an activist and volunteer about these topics at a very local level, at least. But yeah, if you could describe for us like some sense of the topics that you found most interesting from producing your podcast over the years, because I know you've done nearly 300 episodes now, and they've covered a big gamut. And I'm curious which topics you still come back to or haven't covered yet that you think you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned the pandemic, and of course, the lockdown and the pandemic is very much a part of the origin story of the Active Towns channel and the Active Towns podcast in and of itself, because it really kind of forced me to, double down on that content creation process. And if you look back, you'll see that, literally my first episodes were right around February 2020. I was looking at the reality as I started seeing, basically the virus spreading and what was kind of on the horizon. And it just gave me that nudge to like, okay, I knew I wanted to do this anyways, i.e. start a podcast. And I'd been meaning to do it over the previous few years. And I'm like, okay, this is the excuse. Boom, I'm going to pull the trigger and do this. And so I literally did get a few episodes in before the actual lockdown started, but right about the time when we saw that, travel's not going to be possible. Prior to that, for the previous 3 to 5 years, I was actually traveling a lot, filming a documentary, trying to document the transformation of various cities across North America to try to create a more walkable and bikeable, specifically actually bikeable environment. And so it kind of thrust me into that. Now, since it was born from that period of the lockdown and the pandemic, a lot of those early themes were very much a part of that. And very much like what you were just mentioning there, is that we had a renewed sense of what it is our public spaces are, and specifically what our streets are for. You know, my streets are for people logo here on my sweatshirt. I noticed that in my neighborhood, and I started documenting through all my interviews, because even if that wasn't the subject of the episode, it always came up, you know, that transformation of our streets becoming more friendly for people to walk and bike and roll and stroll in their environment, especially if it was an environment where it was conducive to doing that. For instance, my neighborhood, it was built, you know, planned out in the 1920s, 1930s, started building immediately post World War II, and there's no sidewalks. And so when we are walking in our neighborhood, we're walking in the street. And so during that lockdown period of time, you'd see, you know, maybe one car an hour, you know, go through an area, and you just see people walking and biking and, you know, keeping distance and waving and connecting with their neighbors. So you started to see a transformation in sociability, and yes, being able to like meet your neighbors, etc. Now, the interesting ongoing effect of that, at least in some neighborhoods, including our neighborhood, is that the streets are still for people. We are still seeing the numbers of the neighbors and people out walking and biking in our neighborhood. And we're even drawing people in from you know, apartments 2 blocks away that are on a road, and they come over. They're walking their dogs. They're walking through. They'll come out and talk with me as I'm doing work in the front, you know, front yard and the front garden. They'll stop by and they'll comment about the landscaping and everything. And so you see that enhanced sociability. So yeah, I mean, that was definitely one of the early themes that continued, and still even to this day, it'll pop up every once in a while where we will reflect back and say, yeah, I mean, that really helped change the paradigm of a lot of people in terms of realizing that, oh yeah, streets are for people. Some of the other recent paradigms and topics that continue to come up and really have bubbled up a lot within the last 5 years is car dependency and car centricity, and as Professor Ian Walker has termed it, motonormativity of, you know, or car brain thinking. It also goes by the name of windshield bias. And so these are topics that are oftentimes being talked about these days recently.
Totally. I'm happy to go deep on that one.
Yeah.
It's something I think about on a daily basis. But one of the things I wanted to comment about for our audience is just how, what I found really awesome about your productions is how you've traveled a lot. Like one can quickly tell that you've traveled internationally, domestically to the US, and have seen a lot of communities, and have even gotten these tours that are really cool from folks who show you their city or their neighborhoods. And you alluded to this when you're describing your neighborhood and its history as a World War II suburb, post World War II suburb, and how locally, you know, there's this very local specific history that influences the built environment and sort of the path dependency of the city. And for folks
and if I can jump in too,
sure,
just so there's no confusion with the audience, is that, yeah, it was a post-World War II neighborhood, but immediately post-World War II. Our little cottage is circa 1946. And so immediately post-World War II looks a lot different than just even a few years later. In fact, even in our neighborhood, if you just go a couple blocks west, you're walking that direction, you're like, oh, the architecture is changing. Oh, no more front porches. Oh, more emphasis on garages. And you start to see in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and 80s, when you go through those decades, even the architecture changes. And so the post-World War II suburb, when we say that, that phrase, it brings up a vision, a visualization of something that, you know, very much this neighborhood, you know, in literally our block here, is, well, just as an example, you know, the cottages, the houses are like 700 square feet. I mean, you just don't see that anymore. You know, you don't see that concept of really, really small houses with a leaning into an emphasis on neighborliness and sociability and front porches, and not so much what we see later post World War II, which is, you know, insert people and cars in garage, cloister yourself in, and then your activity is in the backyard, not in the front yard. So I just want to clarify that real quick.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, I appreciate that clarification. I myself reside in San Mateo, California, which is a suburb of San Francisco, and it was really built out as a post-World War II suburb in the same manner. And it's, you know, been decades and decades and decades, 70 years since post-World War II began, and experienced a couple waves of that as far as development goes. It's pretty developed as far as all the developable land in the municipality, but I'm curious to, you know, share our audience who might not reside where either of us do. How did you come about this education in what led to your community where you reside looking the way it does? I think that's something that I came to in part from talking with neighbors who'd been here a long time and going to the local library, honestly. But it's not information that people often seek out. And so I think it's self-evident for me why you would want to learn a little bit about why your neighborhood looks the way it does. But for folks who, you know, haven't even thought about it before, what would you suggest if somebody, you know, is living in Minnesota or Florida and are wondering, you know, why their community looks the way it does?
Yeah, I think some of there's multiple layers to your question there. And so first I'll start off with the epiphany for me. In other words, how did I make that transformation and start thinking about the built environment in the way that I did? I alluded to the fact that earlier in my career, the early stages of my career were really looking at healthcare cost containment and disease prevention strategies. I mentioned I worked with Fortune 500 companies, and literally I was on their corporate campuses developing programs to address chronic disease and really even health and well-being in the short term. And so I was literally helping these organizations, these large companies, the IBMs, the Motorola's of the world. I even worked for Pacific Bell, the old phone company right there in California. And my early career started out right there in the Bay Area, and in San Ramon, which used to be one of the AT&T, or it is now AT&T, considered AT&T, but back then it was Pacific Bell, Pacific Telesis. So anyways, I was working on these strategies, and really the epiphany for me of shifting from creating these corporate campuses, creating environments which encourage healthy, active living within these, you know, sort of, you know, cloisters of employees coming in and then having an opportunity to you know, improve their health and wellness and their livelihood, improve their lifestyles. It was really by accident. It was me actually moving from Boulder, Colorado to Honolulu, Hawaii, to take a new job where I was, you know, actually on the road a lot. I was working with orthopedic surgeons and other folks, and working directly with patients because my background is in physiology, and I have a strong medical background as well. And so I was actually working with patients, working with surgeons and pain docs and all that. And so I was on the road all the time. And I was just like blown away by how car-centric Honolulu was. And I was also at the time an Ironman distance triathlete. And so I was supposed to be out on the road training for my next race, which was going to be up in Penticton, British Columbia, up in Canada.
I know that Ironman is pretty famous, but I think people should get an explanation of what an Ironman
Yeah,
triathlon is. 'Cause
it's
it is
insane,
a
is what it
feat.
is. I was in my 30s back then, folks, and Ironman distance triathlon is a 2.4 mile swim, 112 miles on the bike, and then running a marathon, and you do it
Back to back.
back to back to back all day long. So it's an all day experience. I wasn't fast, particularly fast. I just enjoyed more so the lifestyle of being out training, being on a bike, running, you know, getting together with friends, either swimming in the open water like the ocean or at a pool, etc. But yeah, it was an epiphany for me when I moved to Honolulu, because I thought I was moving, from Boulder, where I had winter. I thought I would have endless summer. I'd be able to train all year round and be able to get fitter and faster and all this kind of stuff. I get there and I'm just blown away by how hostile the streets are. I couldn't even comfortably run from my little room that I was renting, and I was just, I was blown away and I was bummed. And so I withdrew from the race that I was in. I sold my bike, bought a surfboard, joined a paddling club, and just focused on the water. So that was the beginning of me, like, okay, planting the seed of, it really matters where you live and how conducive it is for you to have the active lifestyle that you like. Fast forward a year or so, and I had the opportunity to move to a different island. So I moved to the big island, the island of Hawaii, and I moved to Kona, which is like the mecca of Ironman. That's where the World Championships is held every October. And so I made that move, etc. I was fine. And immediately I got re-engaged with the sport, bought a new bike, got back into training again, and really enjoying the fact that I had safer places. Right about that time, I got involved because this piqued my interest. I says, okay, there's a connection here. I need to understand better about this, because when I was in Boulder, I could train all the time. I had really wonderful opportunities to run and bike and swim, etc. And so moving to the Big Island gave me the ability to have an enhanced awareness. That enhanced awareness led to me getting engaged and involved, and then serving on the board of directors for a local bike and pedestrian and trails advocacy organization. It's called Path Hawaii. And so, yeah, long story short, that's the transformation that got me engaged. Once I went down the advocacy rabbit hole, then soon after became the urbanism rabbit hole, discovering Chuck Marohn and Strong Towns, discovering the Congress for New Urbanism. And yeah, here we are,
Yeah.
a couple decades later, and very much a part of that situation. So that was by happy accident. That was just sort of, I did this for a career move and et cetera. And then that just kind of hit me over the head of, oh, this sucks. I hate being in this car-centric place. The move here and intentionally moving to this type of neighborhood was very much just that. It was very intentional, because by that time we had awareness of the built environment, the types of neighborhoods, and the desire to live car light. And so when we made the move from Hawaii to Austin, Texas, we reduced down to just one car, and we shipped our aging, 2005 Honda Element over here, so that we could continue to drive it here in Austin. But our goal was to not have to drive it at all on a weekly basis. If we could, we would have it, we'd preserve it. It would be there for road trips or when we really need it, but we wanted to live a car light lifestyle. And that's why we intentionally chose this neighborhood. We first started out in an apartment, then we went to a condo, then we went to this little cottage. And so it was in steps. It was in interim steps. And so it was very much a thought process of, we want to be able to get to our meaningful destinations by walking and biking and using transit. And then we've got the backstop of the cars there if we really, really need it. And so I guess to kind of fast forward, to your final question is, what about, like people who are living in like these other areas, how can they do that? If they're in a position where they're going to be making a change and they're going to be moving into a new neighborhood, then like looking at it through that lens of, can I find a place where I have access to safe cycling infrastructure? Do I have safe destinations where I can easily walk to, or is it walkable distances? Do I have access to transit? And so having that filter in through that decision process, if you have the privilege to be able to move and be able to choose, you can do that intentionally, and hopefully that will also result in a overall improvement in housing affordability, because we know that oftentimes our walkable and bikeable and transit served neighborhoods tend to be more pricey. And so oftentimes we just like automatically discount them and say, oh, well, it's not affordable for me to be able to live in that walkable, bikeable place because it's desirable, et cetera. But take a step back before you just throw that neighborhood out and say, oh, no, I can't do that. Take a look at the fact that, oh, but what if we are able to actually reduce the number of cars in our family? Could we go car light? Could we go car free even? And then that changes the equation of the affordability, because you're also accounting for your transportation costs. And, AAA themselves, AAA, says that it's right around $12,000 on average per car. Yeah, per year. So it's like, that's a pretty nice bump into, putting that money towards a mortgage or putting that money towards rent. So anyways. So I don't know how well that answered your question, but I wanted to give you that origin story and the transformation and being able to choose this. And I think that that's one of the recommendations that I would have, because almost every city has some, neighborhoods that are like what we're talking about, where, maybe they're older neighborhoods and maybe you get less house for the dollar. But again, we love the fact that we're within walking and biking distance to downtown. Yeah.
No, this is a perspective that I came around to really slowly. I had never really thought about that layout of the land in the places where I resided until COVID hit, and I really explored my city of residence on foot and understood distances a bit better, and understood from talking with neighbors some of the history. I mean, long back history. I mean, San Mateo is not a European style city with a millennia of history behind it, but it does have a major train line that predates the city being incorporated. And up and down the San Francisco Peninsula are a series of commuter towns with their own train stops. And so those are the historical city centers, and where walkable neighborhoods really first existed before the rest of the suburban sprawl got built out. And there's a really noticeable conflict or competition that arose post-World War II between the historical downtown commercial district and a new style mall that got built out. And there was so much fear and concern in that post-World War II city planning that the mall would take away all commercial retail traffic from the downtown, and the downtown would implode.
Well, it pretty much did. I mean, that was a self-fulfilling prophecy, and oftentimes it was very much by design. And unfortunately, that did happen, and it caused a loss of a lot of wealth, and many people did, move out of the downtown areas and the downtown adjacent neighborhoods for the hinterlands, for the suburbs, for the outlying areas. You mentioned distances there, and I think it's really important from a North American context, because earlier you alluded to the fact that I do have the privilege of traveling a lot and getting over to Europe and other locations to document, their situation and what we can learn from that. When it comes to distances here in North America, I like to reinforce the fact that a good 30 to 40 to 50% of all car trips are inherently bikeable distances. And when you stop and you you think about that, you're like, oh, wait, yeah, that's totally true. Now, a person's work commute might be longer. They might actually have a 20-mile, journey, but it's like all those other trips that are, inherently walkable and bikeable. You mentioned the train stops and being able to be served in the Bay Area there by a network of transit and the ability to get on. Maybe that's your journey that, you have for your commute journey. And then it falls back to what you had just said, which is, okay, when I get off that transit, is it walkable? And we have to be, I think, really, really honest with ourselves in North America of what that means and what the actual, logistics are like, and what the actual scenario is on the ground. Because a walkable distance, most people only feel comfortable walking a very short distance unless it's an incredibly enjoyable, environment. Like if you're in Manhattan, you'll easily get 20, 10, 20, 30,000 steps in just because you're like going from one cool thing to the next, etc. But when it comes to like this intentional commute trip or trip to a meaningful destination for other types of things, we need to be realistic of the fact that if it's over, a half a mile, for somebody, they're not going to probably choose to walk it. And that's where the bike really just shines. That bike train, bike transit combination is magical when you're able to overlay an all ages and abilities active mobility network. So if you've got safe cycling infrastructure that connects to transit stops and transit locations, being able to get people to their meaningful destinations, the ability to, like, for instance, when I'm traveling, in Europe, when I'm traveling here in North America, I'm traveling with my Brompton bike. So whether I'm on Amtrak or I'm on, the NS system, in the Netherlands, I've got my folding bike. I'm able to tuck it underneath my seat when I get to my destination. I unfold the bike and I go. I'm able to now have a 9 times increase in the radius where I can go to, and I can easily, clip off 3 miles, 4 miles, 6 miles, whatever. Add into the technology enhancement that we have now with electric assist, you can totally see that somebody could, have part of their journey be get off transit, jump on a bike share bike that has an electric assist to it, and easily, again, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 miles with that electric assist, and also not be overly, sweaty when you get to your destination, because you don't want it to be a workout. You're just making a trip. So anyways, I wanted to mention that because you mentioned distances there. And I think that that is one of the things that we would behoove ourselves here in North America, is not to just stop at saying walkable. Yes, we do need walkable places, surrounding these transit stops and these meaningful destinations to be able to get there. But that distance is really short. Like, for instance, the first 100 meters off of a train stop, people want to see stuff that's meaningful right there. I mean, it's super close. It draws you in. But again, the number of people who are willing to walk, 1,000 meters, a mile to be able to get to a destination, very, very low. So that's where the bike is magical.
Totally. Yeah. I've heard around public transit planning with bus stops and more permanent train stations that folks' average tolerance for walking, and I don't think this is unique to North America, but a 5-minute walk is the upper bound.
Yeah, it's pretty natural that, a quarter mile is like what you're looking at. You're looking at, well, okay, 400 meters, yeah, okay, piece of cake. When you get out to 800 meters, half a mile, you're like, yeah, no. Where's that Uber?
Yeah.
It's like suddenly we're like, okay, can I get on a convenient, streetcar line that's right there? Can I get on, some sort of easy shuttle to get to my destination? Would I, from an active towns perspective, from an exercise physiology perspective, would I consider or prefer that people feel, empowered to just hoof it? Heck yeah, I would. But then that also goes into the fact that we really have to have a truly safe and inviting environment that's rich and beautiful and comfortable. Now you're really starting to completely transform what that built environment looks like, which you should do, to really encourage people to hoof it and just start walking because, oh, this is comfortable, this is safe, this is beautiful. Yeah.
I know that it can feel overwhelming as someone who came to this subject later in midlife, and overwhelming in terms of being able to influence this in their own existing neighborhood. You alluded that people vote with their feet to some extent, and you can reevaluate your neighborhood as you see it entirely and consider alternatives to driving everywhere, like for these 50% of trips that are walkable and bikeable. If there's one, and maybe I'm not seeking advice for what people individually can do about their neighborhoods to make them more walkable and bikeable today, but what's one thing let's center it to North America, but what's one thing that every city in the US could do today that would make their cities more amenable to active transportation, make themselves more active towns?
Yeah, I think probably, the way that you set the question up originally too is spot on. It's like, what can we do? How can we feel we have agency of being able to influence this? And then that will help the community, the city leaders and the administration be able to move forward. And it's inherent in the name of your podcast. It's like, we need to actually meet our neighbors. We need to actually talk with our neighbors. We need to actually reestablish what it means to be in a neighborhood and to talk about these issues, and maybe not even leading it with it being an issue in quotes. It's like just get to know them. And I like to be conspicuous in my enjoyment of my neighborhood. I go outward in terms of riding my bike and smiling and waving and talking with neighbors and commenting on the flowers in their front yard. And I'm being sociable, and while doing that, I'm also sending a message that, oh, by the way, active mobility, walking and biking in the neighborhood is like enjoyable too. And so you're reinforcing what it means to be in a neighborhood and what is really cool about living where you're at. And it does help when you're not necessarily living on a traffic sewer. If you are living on a traffic sewer, it's going to be really, really difficult to feel comfortable doing that. But then that's one of the reasons why our neighbors that live 2 blocks over that live on a traffic sewer come 2 blocks in and stroll by our place and ride their bikes here. And so, we're able to have that. So that's the first step, that we have to start having these conversations and meeting our neighbors and growing the quote unquote tent of awareness about what it means to have livable, lovable places, active towns, and sharing conversations, sharing messages, sharing the active towns videos with your neighbors, and helping to spread the word, sharing within your networks, your family networks, your social networks about these topics, and say, oh, did you realize, induced demand, this is what this means. And these concepts that are wonky can be relatable if we talk about them and share them with real life experiences. So that's the first step, is really getting together, getting to know your neighbors. The next step is really starting to grow the tent of a movement and starting to align with others and saying, yeah, no, we really should be able to feel like it's safe to be able to walk and bike and get around and drive too. It shouldn't be unsafe to even get in a car. And so really understanding. And I think it's a really, really important in our times of politicalization and polarization that we don't get into, you know, it's us versus them and tribes. It's really trying to find commonality of, well, everybody wants to, you know, be in a situation where they don't feel their life is threatened. You know, this should not be a politicized and should not be a controversial topic. And so being able to bring down the temperature, bring down the rhetoric, not use demeaning language to, you know, to create that us versus them dynamic is really, really important to growing the movement and, you know, having productive conversations with your neighbors. Then beyond that, it's engaging with, well, who are the organizations in our neighborhood, in our communities that are working on this? Oh, let's join the Strong Towns chapter, you know, or not chapter, but the local conversation. Let's join ... etc.
Bicycle pedestrian activities league or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've had this very real experience myself of crossing political lines over topics of physical safety. There was a controversial ballot measure put to the city's voters where I live this past cycle, and I had one sign up in front of our residence, and a few neighbors had the opposing side up. I'm happy to share that my side prevailed on the ballot measure, but
Yeah.
on the other hand, this neighbor I hadn't met before raised concerns about vehicular speeds on our street.
Yeah.
And we connected over that and talked through it and strategized about how to convey our needs to the city and how to overcome the barriers that the city puts up to traffic calming measures.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is such a nonpartisan, universal concern of creating space for physical safety of residents, and
Yeah. Well, and I think
yeah.
I think a big part of this too, Max, is people who are quote unquote on the other side of the issue. Oftentimes they're on the other side of the issue because they can't really see themselves in that situation. I'll give you a great example, is that you know, oftentimes if they don't ever walk or bike anywhere, they can't imagine that other people would want to walk or bike, you know, in their neighborhood, in this environment that is being proposed to be transformed into a safer, more inviting place for all ages and abilities. And so I think that we have to be empathetic to the fact that they are coming from a place where they don't see, you know, themselves there. Maybe, you know, and that can oftentimes be the fact that, you know, maybe they're not seeing anyone in their same generation. Like if they happen to be older, maybe they're just not seeing older adults, people, peers of them participating. And so having that opportunity to see, you know, peers of theirs, they're doing that. They're like, oh, okay, I get it. If they happen to be young parents with children and they pile their kids into the minivan or the SUV every single day, and that's their life, and they never see any of their peers with children out walking and biking, then they maybe just assume, well, it's not for us, it's only for those young fit people, you know, on racing bikes that are going through. That's not us. And so I think it's really important to understand that if we want to create that bigger tent, we have to have that message be very inclusive. I literally just did an interview yesterday with Isabel Clement from Wheels for Wellbeing in the UK, and she's in a wheelchair. So she's a wheelchair, you know, a person who is, you know, gets around by wheelchair and by adaptive cycle. She's a cyclist. In her mind, she is a cyclist. She gets around by an adaptive cycle. And so we talked about the fact that a big part of her work with Wheels for Wellbeing is to create an enhanced awareness within the disability community that, you know, safe streets and safe and inviting cycling infrastructure is for you too. Because oftentimes there's an assumption that, oh, it's not for me, it's only for able-bodied people. So
Yeah, no, I've seen the ability and disability be weaponized
yes,
on both sides. And as someone who is occasionally disabled by injury, I can see why it's totally difficult to there. It's not a homogenous group to
yeah,
address and speak to their needs. And um, becoming injured, maybe from excess exercise or vehicular violence or just disease, it totally changes your perspective of everything. It
right,
changes your perspective of distance. It changes your perspective of your neighborhood and where you reside now meets your physical needs. And
yeah,
this neighbor I'm specifically thinking of, who we met and chatted together about traffic calming, um, she's probably late 60s, early 70s, and I think there's a lot of my neighbors who fit that demographic who don't really know what this chapter of life holds for them,
right,
and aren't sure what might change about their lives or about their environment they've lived in for decades,
right.
which would induce them to move. And I can only witness what they're going through. And
Yeah. Well, most people
yeah,
want to, you know, once they get to that age, most people want to age in place.
for sure.
And many of those people, if they happen to live in a car-centric environment, many of those people are fearful of the day when they are no longer able to drive, because they'll, rightly so, believe that they'll be losing their sense of mobility and freedom. And so I think that that's part of what is inherent in how we approach things when we're advocating for safer, more inviting, all ages and abilities environments and mobility choice. We're including the fact that, you know, yeah, we're not trying to take anything away. We don't want to take away your ability to get places. We want to enhance the mobility choice and enhance freedom of choice, so that if you are no longer able to drive for a variety of different reasons, um, hopefully you'll be able to have mobility choice. Hopefully you'll be able to, if you can, you walk, or you know, if you can roll or stroll, you know, hopefully you can get to meaningful destinations, including just down the street to chat with a neighbor.
What well, I this is really deep on my mind, but the activation energy required to get someone to reevaluate transportation options,
Yeah,
or the paved road ahead of them that
yeah,
they follow as far as their transportation choices. You worked on this topic for workforces.
yeah.
What's maybe a helpful framing for how to think about approaching a neighbor and talking about going on a walk together, or riding the bus together, or even going on a bike ride together? Maybe they don't own a bike, but you're happy to lend them one, or
It's that first
whatever.
conversation, right? It's
Yeah,
like you can't ever get to that position where you feel confident and it doesn't feel creepy, you know, until
yeah,
you've like already started that conversation. We have to realize too, you channeled the fact that yes, I literally have been working on this for 35 years, because in my early career, I was working on habit formation. I was looking on, you know, creating healthier habits. We're still here. If we have a habit of, regardless of our journey, we reach for the car keys, that becomes a habitual, you know, activity. It becomes a habit. And what I try to reinforce with the Active Towns channel and the Active Towns movement is to understand that if we can transform our built environments into truly welcoming, enjoyable environments, that helps establish a habit, a habitual behavior that helps us out here. And that happens in the brain. This is literally pathways in the brain where if you do something and it was enjoyable and you're like energized when you get back and you felt, yeah, that was really cool. I'm really glad that, I decided to walk on that trip. I saw the flowers in bloom. I really am super stoked that I decided to ride that trip. I saw some really cool stuff and it brings a smile to my face. For me, it brings a smile to my face every time I ride or walk in my neighborhood and I see, parents and kids out, walking and biking in the street. And that just uplifts my mood. Well, guess what? If you do that frequently, you start to establish pathways in the brain that are the genesis of habit formation. And so that's one of the things that I really try to emphasize with cities and communities and even advocates is do everything that you can to transform the environment to be truly safe and inviting and welcoming, and if at all possible, also beautiful, because these are the things that really help with that habit formation. Because there's another side of habit formation, which is just, is it practical? Is it pragmatic? Is it easy to do? And so those also have to be taken into consideration as well. Is it practical and pragmatic for me to get on the bike and get to the grocery store? In my case, it is. It's actually even more practical and more pragmatic than driving there. And so it establishes that, that habit. And, in the decade that I've lived here, I can count on one hand the number of times I went to the grocery store in a car, just because it's way easier to do it by bike. And recently I've been deciding to actually walk there, simply because it's like, oh, this is a nice little round trip. I can take a backpack, go pick up a few things and then get back. And then guess what? My hour and 15-minute walk is done.
Yeah.
It's a double benefit right there.
I think something folks might not appreciate about active towns lifestyle and opting for non-car transportation is it's shocking just how often you'll leave the house and see people like I think this was a massive revelation for myself in the last couple of years is I can't leave the house without seeing someone I know and without having a social interaction with someone who I'm happy to see. I don't think
How cool is that? When you think of it,
yeah.
I mean, that's the whole point of having more opportunities to get out of our hermetically sealed metal boxes. If we can get out of the car more often, it doesn't mean that we're anti-car. It doesn't mean that we don't want to ever have a situation where people can drive to places. That is going to be our reality. It is our reality. It is the reality in meccas of places where people can walk and bike to meaningful destinations. Throughout the Netherlands, you will see plenty of cars. So you're still able to do that. It's still a practical and pragmatic way to get around. We just want to make sure that it's also practical and pragmatic and enjoyable and sociable for people to be able to walk and bike, use transit as well. And that's the coolest thing I think about, all of this is that that adds to that joy that I was just talking about that helps with habit formation is when you do go out and run into a friend. Those interactions are cool.
Totally agreed. It's been an awesome positive game changer for me and my wife and has really broadened our proximate community. One of the things that I think is worth touching on that I know is probably not touched upon in your podcast episodes, but I've noticed in where I live that I do encounter poverty, like very visible poverty when walking and biking and taking public transit. And as a middle-aged man, I'm not threatened by it. I'm not worried that someone experiencing homelessness and maybe going through drug withdrawal will orient themselves violently at me and that I'm unsafe in the public places I walk and bike. However, that's something I'm aware is a real reason that influences people's transportation choices. And
Yes.
I kind of see this sliding scale of transportation choices from cars, which, like you say, there's not an effort to ban them. They're pretty established technology, all the way down to walking on your feet or rolling in a wheelchair. There's a scale from
Sure.
using your feet or arms to a four-wheel motorized living room. And people kind of, as they gain wealth, they're buying their way out of being in the public space,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
what I've observed. And I
We,
kind of, yeah,
I actually do hear that a lot. You had
yeah,
mentioned it probably doesn't come up much, but it actually does. It comes out a
okay.
lot. Sometimes it comes out in comments, in the comments section of the YouTube videos and, on the channel,
Mm,
where folks will say, well, yeah, that's great, but, in our, city, dot, 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 fill in the blank, it doesn't matter. We've got homeless encampments that are now on the multi-use paths under the bridges, et cetera. Um, when I talk about creating safe and inviting all ages and abilities networks for active mobility, part of the safe and inviting part of it is an imperative to make sure that it doesn't feel uncomfortable for all ages and abilities to be able to participate in their community and be able to walk and bike to meaningful destinations. Now, homelessness and houselessness is a grander and much bigger issue than what I'm focused on, and I'm not certainly an expert in it, but it can influence and impact negatively the ability for people to feel comfortable within their environments if, to your point, you don't feel threatened, but, you know, your wife may, or your daughter might, or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's imperative that cities are looking at all of this holistically and looking at some of the root causes of why there's so much in terms of these challenges. And it's, I actually did a little bit of work in addiction for a while. For about a year I was working in the Denver area, and throughout Colorado, working with schizophrenia and also with bipolar disorder. And so I actually worked with a lot of public clinics and working with directly with many people who were part of were suffering from homelessness as well as addiction. And so I certainly don't have a high level of expertise in the complex aspects of it, but I certainly have a good appreciation for it because I was actually working directly with, the doctors who are working with them and trying to help get them under care so that they, could get the help that they needed. So all that to say, yeah, it's complex and it's all interrelated and interconnected. And so one of the things that I talk about in terms of one of the things that is, an absolute core tenet to active towns is that we have the ability to build more housing close to meaningful destinations. So take a step back and look and see how difficult it is from a zoning perspective and from the codes that are in place. Do you have parking minimums? Do you have minimum lot size minimums? Are you in a situation as a city where you can't even build affordable housing and a plethora of housing? Or are you in a situation where only the affluent can live here, in this area, and there is amber around single family zoning?
Totally. This is a very contemporary topic of where I reside, and I don't mean to stigmatize poverty or I think I had a very sobering conversation with um, a city staff member who works in public works and sort of monitors. I couldn't tell you precisely his role, but he seems to always be on the downtown main mall when I'm there. And he and I got to talking about specifically an issue of the pedestrian mall where there are adolescents who've got e-bikes and they're doing wheelies, and creating an unsafe environment that deters people from walking and fully utilizing the pedestrian mall. But there's these dual problems in the downtown. One is that there's highly visible poverty. There's folks who will sleep on the entranceways to restaurants and stores on the Strip. And then there are also these youth who are, there's a scarcity of public space for them to recreate is the truth of why they're doing that there. And this city worker was asking me what I think and how they should deal with it. And I said, well, you should get more people here. Like, the more people that are here, the more safe an environment it is, the more eyes there are on the problems, the more, mindful these youth will be about the public space that they're coming into conflict with, of folks who are recreating as well. And
well, you just said it, eyes on the street. So that brings us back to Jane Jacobs and the fact that that's how in our neighborhoods, in our communities, that sort of thing was quote unquote handled. It wasn't calling the police in. It was like, no, you had eyes on the street, and the people who would speak up and say, it's like, Johnny, I know your mom and dad, and you're behaving improperly. That's part of how that was handled.
There was one, I guess, final topic that I wanted to put to you. Is that there's that spectrum from fully powering your mobility using your body to fully motorized, pushing your foot, or even maybe autonomous vehicle.
Right.
There's a lot of innovation happening in the middle zone, like electric scooters being one example, where you're twisting your wrist and you just go. It solves an incredible amount of problems as far as demand for street storage and road use. However, what you'll hear criticisms about e-bikes and e-scooters is that they are cannibalizing bicycling and walking. And I was curious what your thoughts are on this contemporary trend, and where that fits into active towns, given that a lot of folks riding electric scooters are young, totally capable of walking, jogging, biking. They're not going away. They're not getting banned.
They're not going away. But what we're seeing is with our electric mobility devices, micro mobility, they're maturing, they're evolving. Back in 2006, when they started, really being dropped on our streets, and in 2007, when they really started taking off, and it was like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere, and we're tripping over them, and there's all these other negative externalities of them. But from my mind, is you mentioned, that there's perhaps a younger demographic that like gravitates towards them, and they're like, this is cool, this is fun. Again, joy. Fun. You see the trend here. Guess what? Well, these micromobility devices, they need a safe place to operate. Okay, let's make sure that they're not having to feel like the only safe place they can operate is on the sidewalk. Okay, let's make sure that our active mobility network, our cycle network, is safe enough and wide enough to accommodate, these devices, as well as the recent trend of electric assist cargo bikes and family bikes. An entire, SUV size, family can get into, a Bachfiets and, roll down to an evening out. And so I don't see them as a threat to active mobility. I see them as yet another mobility option for mobility choice and mobility freedom. And, for the, maybe, a group of young professionals or, whatever, are having a great night out and et cetera. And they're like, hey, let's jump on that e-bike or that shared e-scooter and go to our next destination, wherever that is, rather than hailing an Uber or a Lyft, or a rideshare ride. It's like, I don't have any problem with that. I think it's fine. Now, in the case of throttle e-bikes that are incredibly powerful that start to undermine the safety and well-being of other people who are walking and biking in the environment, yeah, we have to manage that situation. We don't want to demonize the device or the people who are on those devices, but we do want to work productively towards managing that situation, just like we would manage any other situation. Great example is, a shared use path that has people walking and biking and people in wheelchairs, rolling along, and adaptive cycles. You wouldn't want to necessarily throw, some, sport cyclist who is on, an analog bike, but can, easily travel 25 to 30 miles per hour on said bike on said multi-use path. That's a dangerous situation. So behaviors matter. And, having situations and having systems in place to help educate and enhance awareness and work things out so it's safer and inviting for everybody involved is there. So it comes back to, again, creating a culture where, again, just like the eyes on the street that we were talking about, and speaking up and saying, no, that's not appropriate, we need the same thing in throughout our cities, and being able to to do that. One of the things that has oftentimes come up in North America is, we need better enforcement. We need law to step in and do this. And so I pose that question to my friends in the Netherlands. It's like, well, how is it that everybody is just kind of getting along, and you don't really see the law, the police stepping in very frequently? And their answer to me was that that's the last resort. People will speak up. People will say, no, your behavior is inappropriate. And I literally got a WhatsApp message from one of my past guests on the channel. We did an on-bike interview like you had talked about, which is one of the fun things that I like to do. And he said, yeah, he had an altercation when he was with his young child, with his daughter, with a motorist that got, very, very aggressive behind them. And so, he turned and wanted to, basically, because the guy was getting really, really aggressive with the car and threatening himself and also his daughter. And so, he turned to have a conversation with them, and immediately the Dutch residents all around him came. One took care of the daughter, and the others, surrounded the car, and basically allowed him to have that conversation with the driver, and then they had his back. And it suddenly became obvious to the driver that, oh, I'm behaving badly in this moment. The temperature came down. He eventually drove away very, very slowly and not aggressively. And I think that that's really important. I think at some point in time, we need to get that neighborliness back into our society, and the ability to have conversations with people and bring the temperature down, and reinforce what is an appropriate behavior. And we're not demonizing those others who happen to ride a device that maybe you don't feel comfortable with. I mean, I myself, I've never been on an electric scooter. Just haven't done it.
I,
Haven't felt the
I
need.
I'd urge
So,
you to give it a try.
I know they've got to be fun. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
serious. I mean, it's just like one of the things. I just haven't ever done it. Now, I also have a history of crashing things that are motorized. Like, I was
Fair.
terrible at motor scooters when I was in my 20s, and earlier, on motorcycles and motor scooters. I would inevitably give it too much gas and do a wheelie and crash, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna stick to bikes.
Yeah, no, I hear you. This is high on my mind because I totally agree with you around broadening the tent of
Yes.
folks who have each other's backs. I think there's something folks who might not walk or bike or scooter on a regular basis might
Yeah.
not grasp, is that you are inherently local. You are a local,
Yes.
and that draws an immense amount of allies. I mean, I think I don't have the data, but I think when there are pedestrian, incidences of traffic violence, there's a lot more political outpouring of care than there are for incidences of traffic violence between motorists. And it's because you're inherently local and people can see themselves as being that walker in their neighborhood. And
one would hope. One would hope.
But I do want to, pitch you on trying out electric scooters. I think there's a lot of really interesting dimensions to it. I wouldn't say they've reached 50% of micromobility share in my area, but I was visiting Nice, France a year ago, and they were probably outnumbering bicyclists. I was really surprised.
Well, and then you have situations like in Paris where they were just completely removed.
And in London too. I understand London is really strict on motorized micromobility. But they are a big answer to the housing problem in my mind.
Again, it leans in towards what we were talking about earlier, which is when we look at housing affordability, it's housing plus transportation. Do you have options for low cost mobility that can get you to your meaningful destinations?
Totally. And you mentioned the AAA annual cost of total cost of ownership for cars being now over 13 grand a year, US dollars. And one thing that is really noteworthy to me about that report is that they exclude the cost of car storage at your residence. And I've read, maybe it was a Redfin article, that car storage is nearly or around 10% of housing cost. So
certainly. Redfin, of course, is one of the firms that is, very deep into the real estate, world. And we just lost
Donald Shoup.
We just lost Professor Donald Shoup recently, the author of The High Cost of Free Parking. And he really did a wonderful job of outlining that hidden cost of having to be forced, encouraged, mandated to provide off-street parking. When it gets built into housing cost, it's not free. It's built into it. It's very, very costly. So not surprised.
100%. I mean, doing the math, let's say you're paying $2 or $3 grand a month in rent. Let's say $3 grand. 10% is $300 a month. 300 times 12 is $3,600. So that's a significant underestimation on AAA's
top of that,
part.
12,000 plus. Exactly.
Yeah, so you're getting to 15 grand, 16 grand a year. So I do appreciate electric scooters in that respect, is if they can replace one vehicle in a multi-person household, like the alleviation on cost of living is huge. And whether it's an e-bike or a normal bike or electric scooter, I think it's all good.
As a former surfer, I'll probably be more likely to try one of the electric skateboards.
For sure. From a safety perspective, I think they're probably even a lesser good option.
I know. I'm teasing you. I'm turning 60 years old next month, so it's a good likelihood that I won't do either.
Fair enough. I mean, if you can find a controlled environment like a parking lot with no cars in it, it's
I will say that I will say this, that a lot of people lean in and try to get me to hate on electric assist bikes and all that. And I'm like, no, they're practical, they're pragmatic. I made the decision a couple of years ago to get a Turn GSD, which is a wonderful electric assist with a Bosch electric assist motor. And it's like one of the reasons why we can remain, car light. I'm able to, when I do need to do a larger grocery run, get 200 pounds worth of groceries. It's an easy lift, literally, pardon the pun, when you have an electric assist cargo bike like that. And so I think that's One of the things that I try to really emphasize here on the Active Towns channel is encourage cities to not have a stereotypical assumption as to who cyclists are and what a bike even looks like. It could just start, just think of it as, we're talking about mobility devices here. And again, it could be a family bike with kids in the front. It could be, a cargo bike like mine with, all sorts of grocery storage, behind me on the long tail. It could be, like Isabel Clement with Wheels for Well-Being. It could be an adaptive cycle where, it clips onto her wheelchair and she's able to have enhanced mobility. So I think the one thing that we can do is when we think about what it means to create all ages and abilities, active mobility networks, including the build out of a cycle network, we really expand who we're talking about and who we think of when we think of a cycle, because it could just be a wheeled device. It could be that scooter. It could be a kid, or adult on an electric, skateboard, a one wheel. There's just all of these different opportunities. Anything, I think, that helps alleviate that habit that we talked about earlier of just habitually reaching for the car keys and making that be a car trip. So
Agreed. Well,
yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on. I want to say thank you, John, for joining. This has been awesome. If folks want to, well, of course, we'll include links to your website, YouTube channel, social media. But if folks want to find you, what would you say is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I'm most active out on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also follow me on Blue Sky. That's my primary social media platform right now, other than YouTube. So yeah, follow me on Blue Sky as well as on LinkedIn. And obviously, pop on over, check out the Active Towns channel. And if it's something that you think you'd enjoy, give it a subscribe, and check out some of the videos. Like you said, there's lots of them out there.
Agreed. Awesome. Well, thank you, John.
Thank you.